Have you ever stopped to think that the times we are living in might be more significant than we imagine? The world is in a cycle of transformation, and many of the biblical signs are unfolding before our eyes. Wars, natural catastrophes, the rise of violence, and worst of all, mockery against the faith in Christ. All of this seems to be happening at the same time. But what does this really mean for our future? Are we truly about to enter the most critical phase in human history? Imagine for a moment you're watching the news and suddenly see something that shocks you, a global catastrophe, a war taking unpredictable proportions, or even, as it recently happened, a health crisis that stopped the entire world. And when you look at what's happening around you, the feeling that something is about to happen is unavoidable. What if you had the chance to see the signs of the end times with more clarity? Would you change the way you live your life now? I know this may seem scary, but there is a powerful truth you need to understand. Everything that is happening is not just a sequence of coincidences. The Bible had already warned about these times, and the signs are being fulfilled. The increase of earthquakes, the growth of selfishness, the mockery of Christ. All of this is part of a bigger plan, a plan of transformation and judgment. But there is hope. If you understand these signs, you can prepare and make decisions that will change your life forever. Now, I want to ask you something deeply important. Are you ready to understand how these signs connect and what you can do to be prepared for what's coming next? Are you ready to open your eyes and see the future with a new perspective? If yes, subscribe now, because what we are going to explore today is something that could change your life and your vision of everything that is happening around you. Click on subscribe and activate the bell, because the knowledge you will gain now will be essential to you face the times ahead. Don't wait any longer. Don't put it off. The time to understand the signs is now. Subscribe and come discover what is really happening in the world. Social change prophecy. The Bible, in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 5, describes a future that, day by day, seems closer to the reality we live in. It speaks of dangerous times. Times when people turn away from God and live focused on their own desires and interests. Have you noticed how, more and more, people seem to be more self-centered? It seems the world is becoming more selfish, doesn't it? What do you think? What is happening to our world? If you stop to think, you will realize that this prophecy is being fulfilled before our eyes. People are increasingly focused on themselves, on what they can gain, on what they can have. Selfishness, pride, and disrespect are now almost normal in society. It's no longer surprising to see someone acting rudely or disrespectfully towards others, right? However, these behaviors don't come without consequences, and that's what we are going to explore here. Imagine if you lived in a society where personal pleasure comes first, at the expense of everyone else's well-being. What would happen? The Bible describes that in the last days, people would be lovers of themselves, arrogant, proud, and disobedient to parents. Now, imagine this in action. A person who only thinks about their own desires and needs, without caring about others. This is how many are living today. They want everything for themselves, and this affects not only their personal relationships, but also how society functions. Can you see this around you? It seems that every day, we are seeing more and more of this on social media, in the news, and even in our daily interactions. People publish their lives, caring more about what others will think than the real impact of their actions. The number of selfies is a clear example of this. Instead of connecting deeply with those around them, many are more interested in showing off and presenting a perfect version of themselves. This is selfishness in action. And what does this generate? The consequences of this kind of behavior are not good. The Bible warns us about this. When selfishness takes over, things like betrayal, disrespect, and most importantly, broken relationships arise. When we put I above everything, we begin to see others as objects to be used, rather than people deserving of love and respect. This leads to a more isolated, colder world, and undoubtedly, one more distant from God. Have you ever stopped to think how the world would be different if everyone cared more about the well-being of others? If all of us, instead of seeking our own pleasure, sought to live with more humility, giving, and respect for others, the world would be a very different place. Instead of living in a world full of distrust and disrespect, we could experience an environment of peace and harmony. But the reality is, as society advances, we are becoming more and more distant from this vision. And what happens when people choose selfishness instead of solid values like humility and kindness? They begin to seek fleeting pleasures that, in the end, leave a huge void. And here comes the big problem. The pleasure of selfishness is always temporary. The more we try to satisfy our ego, the less we feel really happy. Have you ever felt that? Deep down, all this focus on the ego leads us to an endless cycle of seeking something that never fully satisfies us. Selfishness blinds us to the true meaning of life, which is to live in harmony with others and with God. If you think the world couldn't get worse, wait until the next point we're going to explore. Now, imagine that as society moves farther and farther away from God, it begins to celebrate everything that was once considered bad. In the past, being arrogant, selfish, and disrespectful were attitudes that were disapproved of. But today, they are almost seen as something normal or even admired. Who hasn't seen someone being praised for being arrogant or challenging? What happens when these attitudes are celebrated? The world begins to lose its sense of morality. Pride and the lack of kindness gain ground, and society as a whole weakens. Evil begins to be seen as good, and kindness becomes something outdated. When humility and kindness are set aside, the world becomes a colder, more indifferent place. Have you noticed how the world has valued what once was considered wrong? What does this say about the direction we are heading? All of this leads us to what the Bible calls the beginning of sorrows. What does that mean? Well, in the last days, the Bible talks about a series of events that will happen in the world, such as wars, plagues, famine, and earthquakes. These are signs of the end. Signs that things will begin to fall apart. And if you think this is an exaggeration, just take a look at the times we are living in. Are you seeing the increase in natural disasters around the world? Did you know that the Bible had already predicted this? And to understand the impact of these changes, look at the increasing frequency of earthquakes, for example. Did you know that every year the number and intensity of earthquakes only increase? This is one of the signs that the world is experiencing a moment of great transition. The prophecy of the beginning of sorrows is being fulfilled before our eyes. What comes next could be even more impactful. But don't be fooled. These signs are not just natural disasters. They have a much greater purpose. The increase in knowledge, as prophesied in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, is one of the great signs of the times. Technological advances, the growth in scientific understanding, and even space exploration are clear examples of how humanity is acquiring more knowledge. If you think science and technology can't be connected with prophecies, wait until you see what comes next. These advances are not just to satisfy human curiosity. They are fulfilling a divine purpose. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, we are warned that knowledge would increase in the last days. And today, we see this in every technological advance, especially in space exploration and biotechnology. Humanity is expanding its capacity to know the world, but this also brings a great challenge. Are we ready to handle so much knowledge? Selfishness in the modern world. Today, when we look at the world, we can clearly see something. Society is becoming more and more self-centered. What was once seen as selfish behavior is now considered normal or even admired. Narcissism and self-absorption are on the rise, and social media only intensifies this phenomenon. What was once a personality trait for a few has now become a predominant characteristic of many people around the world. Have you stopped to think about how society has valued that attitude of my pleasure, my rights, my world? Maybe you've seen someone saying, "I'm the only one that matters," or even on their social media. The person just posting moments when they are at the center of the scene, trying to show a perfect life, without caring about what others are going through. Now, imagine the impact of this on an entire society. If everyone becomes a hostage to themselves, what happens to the next person? What is really behind egocentric behavior? When someone places themselves at the center of everything, it's as if the rest of the world ceases to exist. Have you noticed how conversations on social media, for example, are filled with selfies and less with genuine exchanges of experiences? The virtual world creates a bubble where everything revolves around a perfect image, and the need to be seen and accepted in a superficial way becomes an obsession. This is narcissism. And you can see this not only on social media, but also on the streets, at work, in relationships. What do you do in a world where everyone thinks only about themselves? Imagine a world where people act as if only their own pleasure and satisfaction matter. In many cultures, this has become the norm. Instead of building united communities, people become isolated, focused on their own agendas. Of course, in such a society, values like empathy, compassion, and unity begin to be sidelined. Every man for himself, and God for all, as the saying goes. However, this creates a huge void. No matter how much people constantly seek personal satisfaction, there's always something missing, isn't there? Have you ever felt that even when you achieve what you want, the emptiness remains? Well, it's this emptiness that arises when we become obsessed with ourselves and it is never filled. And the media, how does this affect your point of view? If you turn on the television or enter your news feed, you'll see a flood of messages reinforcing this behavior. Love yourself first. Be your own hero. You deserve the best. These messages are partly good because they encourage self-esteem, but in excess, they create the idea that the world is about what we can conquer without thinking about the consequences of our actions on others. Society is increasingly weaving a network where individualism is the star, and true, deep relationships, those that require sacrifice and dedication to others, are becoming more and more distant. What happens when the search for personal pleasure becomes a priority for everyone? Personal pleasure starts to be seen as the highest value, and soon, the well-being of others is placed in second place. That selfish behavior starts to reflect in daily actions, like in a simple conversation. People begin to talk more about themselves and less about others. Family relationships are also affected. Who hasn't felt, during a family dinner, that everyone is more concerned with their own phones than with the conversation that could unite everyone? Or in situations where someone is seeking the best for themselves, without considering the impact of their actions on others? Can you see the impact of this in your life? How does selfishness affect your relationships? Often, selfishness in today's world disguises itself as self-care, but in reality, it goes beyond that. People are, for the most part, more interested in gaining status, impressing others, being noticed on social media, than in truly loving and caring for one another. This creates a gap between people, an emotional distance, each person looking at their own belly button, instead of seeking a greater good. Can selfishness become dangerous? Yes, and not just on a personal level. When everyone around us is just concerned with satisfying their own desires, this creates a competitive, impersonal, and even hostile environment. On a global scale, this transforms into a society where people begin to be treated as objects and collective well-being is put second. Selfishness, when it spreads, affects the economy, politics, international relations, and, of course, interpersonal relationships. Have you noticed how often political decisions, for example, seem to be made without considering the real impact on the lives of the most vulnerable? This is a consequence of collective selfishness. Everyone acts as if their own self-interest is more important than the good of all. Have you stopped to think about how much selfishness is deteriorating our society? This type of behavior leads to a disconnect from people's own spiritual and human values. As selfishness grows, generosity and compassion decrease. This creates a vicious cycle where everyone is always searching for something to fill a void that, deep down, can only be filled with God and genuine love for others. But what about the cause of all this? Of course, not everyone is 100% selfish, but the tendency is becoming more and more visible. When we set aside issues of faith, love for others, and focus only on our own well-being, we lose the deeper meaning of life. Selfishness is not just a personal problem, but also a social one. It affects everyone around us, creates divisions and conflicts, and distances humanity from what is truly important. If you think this change in human behavior doesn't have a real impact, wait until you see the next topic. If you think selfishness doesn't have a big impact, prepare yourself, because the consequences of this go beyond what you can imagine. As you will see, selfishness brings tragic and devastating results, not only for the individual but for everyone around them. The upcoming consequences of selfishness are alarming and will open your eyes to what is really happening in society. Consequences of selfishness. As selfishness spreads through society, its consequences are devastating. What starts as a simple deviation in personal behavior, such as an excessive search for pleasure or the tendency to put oneself first, ends up manifesting destructively in all aspects of life. Characteristics such as betrayal, arrogance, and excessive selfishness become more common. And the question is, how do we get to this point? What happens when, in fact, the search for our own pleasure becomes more important than any other value, including our devotion to God. Can you see the evolution of selfishness in your life and in the society around you? Imagine that. By putting personal pleasure above all, you begin to lose sight of the spiritual values that were once the foundation of your life. The first impact of this is the loss of respect for others and for the truth. You begin to see people more as obstacles to be overcome, rather than people to be loved and respected. How does this reflect in personal relationships? Do you notice that truth is distorted to fit what benefits each person? And worse, in the name of this pleasure, selfishness turns into betrayal, betraying what is most important. Who hasn't felt the impact of betrayal in their own relationships? Betrayal doesn't just mean a broken romantic relationship. Betrayal is also when you deceive someone you trust, like a friend or family member, to satisfy your own desires. In the context of selfishness, betrayal often comes disguised with justifications like, "I deserve it," or "this is the best for me." But what many don't realize is that by giving in to the temptation of selfishness, you end up harming yourself and others. The incessant search for pleasure, status, or selfish satisfaction leads to a distancing from the Christian values of love and humility. And worse, these actions become patterns and the evil spreads. Selfishness is a virus that spreads, contaminating everything around. Arrogance is another reflection of selfishness. As people become more focused on themselves, they begin to see themselves as superior to others. Instead of being humble and recognizing that everyone has flaws, they place themselves on a pedestal, judging and despising others. How can this affect society? In a society where arrogance predominates, there is no room for forgiveness, dialogue, or understanding. People become more intolerant, unable to accept the diversity of thoughts and cultures. What happens when selfishness begins to become the foundation of everything? Arrogance takes over. You begin to see more and more people acting as if they were above others. Society then turns into a big competition, where winning is more important than mutual respect. Imagine a world where everyone is trying to be the best, without caring about the damage caused to others. A world where everyone is just concerned about standing out. This creates a cycle of distrust and separation, and true human connection is lost. And what happens when pleasure becomes the priority? Another major consequence of selfishness is the incessant search for pleasure, especially when this pleasure is not found in healthy things, but in indulgences that distance a person from God's path. Materialistic pleasure, consumerism, the satisfaction of the senses, all of this starts to be placed ahead of spirituality. People then seek to fill the emptiness in their souls with everything that is temporary, and this becomes a vicious cycle, because pleasure is never enough. No matter how much they search for something to satisfy the mind and body, the emptiness is never filled, because what is missing is a connection with the divine, something that only God can provide. Have you ever felt that, no matter how much you seek happiness, you never fully feel it? It's as if we're running after something but never reaching it. Selfishness, by placing one's own desires first, prevents a person from fully connecting with God or giving themselves to the well-being of others. Temporary pleasure, instead of bringing us closer to God, pushes us further away from Him. It is not by chance that Jesus taught, "What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world, but loses his soul?" Matthew chapter 16, verse 26. As people follow the pursuit of momentary pleasures, they lose the true meaning of life, and the eternal is set aside. Selfishness ends up creating spiritual blindness, and the person gets lost in a sea of temporary desires. But true happiness, the kind that really fills, is in God and living a life of devotion, compassion, and humility. What happens when people lose the thread that holds their existence? When selfishness grows, societies become more corrupt, further away from God. The only thing that can bring us back is humility, the ability to serve others, to put the needs of others ahead of our own. When this doesn't happen, the world becomes a place of despair, pain, and often destruction. Selfishness not only corrodes individual character, but has a profound impact on society as a whole, spreading distrust and breaking the bonds that unite people. And you? What have you been doing to prevent selfishness from taking over your life? If you think this is just a matter of individual choices, think again. Selfishness doesn't only affect the person who practices it. It has a profound impact on the entire community, on society as a whole. Now, if selfishness causes so much damage, What can we do to overcome this evil? How can we return to living in a way that honors God and respects others? If you think this reflection is important, wait until the next topic. In the next topic, we'll explore one of the great temptations that arise as a consequence of selfishness: sinful pleasures. These seemingly harmless pleasures are behind many of the wrong choices we make. And it's important to understand how they can pull us even further away from God. The temptation of sinful pleasures. The incessant search for pleasure is one of humanity's greatest challenges, and many find themselves tempted to choose fleeting and superficial pleasures, forgetting the profound and eternal consequences of these choices. When we think about sinful pleasures, we immediately think of the temptations the world offers. The immediate pleasure that often promises satisfaction, but in the end, leaves an even greater emptiness. What attracts us to these temptations? What makes so many choose momentary pleasure over a lasting relationship with God, which offers true and lasting peace? Have you stopped to think about what really attracts us to immediate pleasures? The pleasure of sin is, in a way, like an irresistible sweet. At first, it gives us a sense of pleasure, of satisfaction. But soon after comes frustration, regret, and often guilt. It's like an empty promise. The Bible warns us about this in 1 John chapter 2, verse 16, where it talks about the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life as things that pull us away from God. These desires are deceivers, and no matter how much they give us momentary pleasure, they never manage to fill the void that truly matters: the need for a genuine relationship with God. Why? Even knowing that temporary pleasure won't satisfy us, do we still seek it? The answer lies in our human nature. Sin offers immediate satisfaction, a quick reward, something we can feel, experience, and enjoy in a tangible way. But while it moves us away from God, this satisfaction is only temporary. One example of this is the excessive consumption of entertainment. When we indulge in the pleasure of a series, movie, or even games, the feeling of happiness is real while we're immersed in it. But as soon as it ends, the emptiness sets in again. No matter how many movies you watch or how many moments of pleasure you seek, there will always be an emptiness that can only be filled by something greater than fleeting pleasure: a relationship with God. Have you felt that? The more you search for pleasure, the more empty you become? This happens because the pleasure of sin is not an inexhaustible source. It is like a bottomless pit, which, the more you try to fill it, the deeper and emptier it becomes. Sin, in its essence, promises to satisfy us, but what it really does is leave us thirsty for more. And the more we give into it, the further we get from what is truly essential: the peace, love, and fullness that God offers. Earthly pleasure will never be enough, and this reflects in our lives. The relentless search for fleeting pleasures makes us ignore the signs that something is missing in our lives, making us lose sight of the fact that there is something much deeper to be sought. What is the consequence of giving into the passing pleasures of the world? As we give into these temptations, we begin to drift away from God. This creates a vicious cycle where, the more we seek satisfaction in worldly things, the further we move away from the purpose for which we were created. The relationship with God, which should be our source of satisfaction, is pushed aside, while we become mired in an incessant search for fleeting pleasures that never truly fill us. Have you ever felt lost in a cycle of seeking pleasure without finding satisfaction? The pleasure of sin, in contrast to the pleasure God offers, is never lasting. The only true satisfaction is the one that comes from a relationship with God, which fills us from the inside out. The pleasure that comes from God is not something that disappears after a while. It is constant, deep, and eternal. When we prioritize the search for pleasure, we move away from this unshakable source of peace and love, and this leaves us with a great emptiness, an emptiness that can only be filled by God's love. What to do to break this cycle? The real solution to this relentless search for pleasure lies in the recognition that nothing in this world will be able to fully satisfy us. Only God can offer us what we really need: a purpose, eternal peace, and a joy that does not depend on external circumstances. But to experience this, we must make a conscious choice. Choose to seek God instead of giving in to the fleeting pleasures of sin. And this is a process of transformation that requires commitment and faith. When we focus on temporary pleasures, we lose what is permanent and true. The search for immediate pleasure, although it seems irresistible, moves us away from the greater purpose of our lives. The consequence of this is emptiness, dissatisfaction, and eventually destruction. Fleeting pleasure leads to suffering, while the search for God brings us true joy and fulfillment. Isn't it amazing how we are constantly challenged to choose between what is temporary and what is eternal? Now that we understand how sin offers momentary pleasure, but leaves us with a deep emptiness, it's time to reflect on the impact this has on our society and our own lives. What is the price of immediate pleasure? How can we then choose lasting satisfaction in God instead of falling into the traps of sin? The temptation of fleeting pleasures may be irresistible, but the rewards of following God's path are infinitely greater and more gratifying. If you think you're tired of pursuing empty pleasures, pay attention, because the next topic will change your view on what really matters in life. The next topic will lead us to one of the biggest problems that arise as a consequence of this relentless pursuit of pleasure: moral decline and the rejection of goodness. When pleasure becomes a priority, morality begins to crumble, and goodness becomes something increasingly rare. Get ready to understand how this affects not only your life but society as a whole. Moral decline and rejection of goodness. We live in times when more and more morality seems to be in decline. What was once considered wrong and even repugnant by society is now not only tolerated but celebrated. Goodness, humility, and values that once were pillars of society are being erased, giving way to a culture that glorifies selfishness, pride, and indifference. What is happening to the world? How do we get to a point where what was considered evil becomes something normal or even admired? And how does this affect our lives, our families, and society as a whole? Have you noticed how society has started to value what was once considered wrong? In past decades, there was a consensus about what was moral and immoral. Family values were respected, honesty was seen as a precious good, and humility was considered an essential virtue. Today, however, we see a drastic change. What was once a source of shame, like dishonesty, selfishness, and indifference, is becoming more common. Social media, for example, is a clear reflection of this. The more someone displays their selfish and uncompassionate lifestyle, the more admired they are and the more followers they gain. This creates a cycle where the pursuit of attention and social approval becomes the highest priority, replacing the commitment to solid values like kindness and compassion. Have you ever stopped to think about how people today act as if pride were a virtue? Pride, once seen as a flaw, is now considered almost a quality. The idea that we should love ourselves and put ourselves first has become a daily mantra for many. Instead of seeing others as equals, deserving of respect and love, the focus has shifted to extreme individualism. This me-first ideology not only harms the way we relate to people around us, but also weakens the morality of society as a whole. What happens when pride, arrogance, and selfishness become more valued than humility and compassion? Simply put, kindness weakens, and indifference begins to take its place. If you think selfishness and pride are innocent, pay attention to what society is losing with this change. Kindness, as a virtue, is gradually being replaced by a flexible kind of morality, where everything seems acceptable as long as it benefits the individual. This leads to a lack of empathy for others' difficulties, creating an environment where people become increasingly insensitive to the suffering of others. As a society, we begin to see others more as threats or competitors, rather than someone with whom we can collaborate or share. This loss of empathy is one of the greatest consequences of moral decline. Actions that once would have been seen as cruelly dishonest or even immoral are now excused with justifications like everyone does it or it's not that bad. And what was once wrong is now minimized or even considered acceptable. Have you noticed how many people no longer care about the well-being of others? When moral values dissolve, far more serious consequences arise than just a deterioration of personal relationships. Society begins to become more competitive and, at times, even more violent. This is because when pride and selfishness become the main drivers, no one cares about the consequences of their actions, and other suffering is seen as irrelevant. Where does this indifference come from? It comes from the excessive valuation of me over us. In a world where kindness and humility are no longer a priority, the dehumanization of others begins to occur, and people begin to believe that only my well-being matters. What happens when everyone starts to think only about themselves? Societies at their core are built on trust and collaboration. When these qualities begin to disappear, the social fabric begins to tear. And this is not limited to personal issues alone. On a collective level, The loss of moral values results in public policies and economic systems that favor only one part of the population, while the rest struggle to survive. This creates an even greater divide between social classes and widens inequality. Where there was once a sense of community and care, a system of fierce competition is established, where concern for others disappears in the name of profit and personal pleasure. What does this mean for the future of our society? As moral decline spreads, we see a growing rejection of kindness, patience, and compassion. When morality deteriorates, society begins to crumble slowly, because the foundation of any healthy society is mutual respect. The fundamental values that sustain human relationships, such as love and kindness, begin to be replaced by selfishness and indifference. This creates a colder, more disconnected society and ultimately a more dangerous one. And the consequences are not limited to the present. They spread across generations. Because what are we teaching our children? What are we showing as an example for the future? Do you think this change in moral priorities doesn't affect the world? What was once unthinkable is now normalized. This is the power of moral decline. It destroys what is most precious in a society, the fundamental values. The departure from kindness and humility only makes it harder to build a better, fairer, and more peaceful world. But what now? What can we do to reverse the situation? The good news is that there is still time to change. We can reclaim kindness, humility, and the moral values that have been lost over time. But this requires both a collective and personal effort. The first step is to return to the teachings of Christ, who always exalted humility and love for others. What we need now is more love, more compassion, more care. If each of us does our part, we might reverse the cycle of destruction and return morality to the world, which it so desperately needs. Comment below what you think about moral decline and how we can change it. If you are ready to understand the impact of morality in our lives, don't miss the next topic, where we will discuss the beginning of the pains we are living now. These signs of moral decline are just the beginning. What is to come could be even more alarming. Prepare for the next topic, where we will explore how the pains of the world are intensifying, fulfilling the prophecies that warn us about the final times. The beginning of the pains, we are living in times of great turmoil. When we look around the world, it is hard to ignore the amount of conflict, suffering, and natural disasters that seem to be intensifying each year. The Bible warns us in Matthew chapter 24, verses 6 to 8, about the beginning of the pains, a period of global turbulence and upheaval, where wars, famines, plagues, and earthquakes will be clear signs that the end times are approaching. The question is, what are we seeing today in the world? Are we already living in this period of pains? And what does this mean for the future of humanity? Have you noticed how the world is increasingly in conflict? Wars are everywhere, with international conflicts and political tensions that seem to increase every day. Conflicts like the one in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, and even tensions at various borders around the world reveal growing global instability. These conflicts, as described in the Bible, are just one of many signs that we are in the beginning of the pains. What the prophecy tells us is that war will not just be an isolated problem, but a global phenomenon, affecting many nations at the same time. And if you look around you, it is not hard to see that these signs are already being fulfilled. And what about the famine spreading across the world? If there is something we can clearly notice in many places, it is the growing food scarcity. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and even some regions in Asia are facing severe food crises. Hunger, once limited to more remote areas, now affects populations in unexpected places, with crises in food production and distribution, along with extreme weather conditions affecting agriculture. The Bible already spoke about this, and the famines we see today are a reflection of what is to come, a clear sign that the pains are increasing. How is the world dealing with plagues and epidemics? When we think of plagues, the first thing that comes to mind is the COVID-19 pandemic, which affected the entire world, causing millions of deaths and disrupting the lives of billions of people. But that's not all. Even after the end of the pandemic, we are still facing outbreaks of other diseases, such as the rise of viral diseases like monkeypox and others that emerge unexpectedly. The prophecy about plagues is not limited to a single disease, but a series of outbreaks that will mark the beginning of the pains. The frequency and intensity of these diseases are only expected to increase, and this is a clear sign that the world is living in moments of great turmoil, as the scriptures predicted. Can you see how the world is living in a constant cycle of crisis? Additionally, we have to consider natural disasters. Earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, droughts, and floods are becoming more and more common, affecting both rich and poor countries indiscriminately. They are no longer just isolated events, but a constant. Climate change is amplifying the frequency and intensity of these disasters, and many scientists and experts are already indicating that we are at a critical point. The Bible talks about earthquakes in various places, and it is impossible to deny that we are witnessing these signs being fulfilled before our eyes. What is behind so many natural disasters? The increase in the frequency of natural disasters is a clear reflection of the growing chaos that the Bible predicted for the last times. And what is even more alarming is that we are living in an era of fast information. We are more aware of these disasters, and this only increases the feeling that we are truly facing a period of transition, where the pains the Bible speaks of are beginning to intensify. The earth is groaning, as the scripture describes, and what we are witnessing are just the first signs of a time of even greater difficulties. When the earth begins to groan, what is coming? The Bible warns us that these pains are not just isolated events, but signs that something greater is coming. Suffering in the world will increase, turmoil will grow, and people will begin to feel that we are entering a period with no return. This is not just a warning for the future. It is a reality we are living right now. The question we must ask ourselves is, how are we preparing for these difficulties? Are we aware that, although the signs of turbulence intensify, it is also an opportunity for us to draw closer to God and live with a true purpose? And what will we do about what is happening around us? The scriptures do not leave us helpless. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 8, the Bible says that these signs of war, famine, plagues, and earthquakes are the beginning of the pains, but that we should not fear, for God is in control. Although the world is going through these difficulties, it is possible to have hope and faith. And the question is, are you ready to face the times of turbulence with the confidence that God is greater than any crisis the world faces? If you think these signs are just coincidences, stay tuned for the next topic. Now that we understand we are living in a time of turbulence, the next topic will show us how the frequency of earthquakes is increasing and how this connects with biblical prophecies about the end times. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next videos and receive alerts about the fulfillment of the prophecies we are living. Increase in earthquake frequency in recent years. The world has witnessed a significant increase in the occurrence and intensity of earthquakes. According to global data, the number of tremors has been growing and the strength with which they occur has intensified. What many don't know is that the Bible had already predicted this phenomenon clearly, and now we are seeing this prophecy come true before our eyes. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 7, Jesus warned that there would be earthquakes in various places, and this sign, along with others, is part of the beginning of the pains that will mark the last days. Have you noticed how earthquakes have become more frequent and intense? In 2021 and 2022, for example, over 20,000 earthquakes were recorded globally, and the magnitudes increased drastically. It's not just about more tremors, but stronger ones that have caused significant destruction in various parts of the world. Countries like Japan, Indonesia, Turkey, Chile, and even the United States have faced large magnitude earthquakes, often followed by devastating tsunamis. These events are no longer isolated incidents, but increasingly common phenomena in various regions of the planet. What is behind such a drastic increase in earthquakes? Science explains that these events are directly linked to increased tectonic activity and the movement of Earth's plates. However, from a biblical perspective, these earthquakes can be seen as a fulfillment of Christ's prophecies. They are part of a set of signs that indicate the beginning of a period of tribulation, where suffering in the world will grow, but it will also be a time of preparation for the fulfillment of God's plan. The increase in frequency and intensity of earthquakes is, thus, a reflection of what is to come, fulfilling the words of Jesus and other prophets, as described in Revelation chapter 6, verse 12. What happens when an earthquake hits a region? The impact of an earthquake goes far beyond the physical shaking of the ground. When an earthquake happens, it not only destroys physical structures, but also psychologically affects people, leaving lasting trauma. Homes are destroyed, lives are lost, and chaos ensues. Even after rescue teams finish their work, the psychological effects of a disaster of this magnitude linger for a long time. Often, the affected areas take years to recover, both physically and socially. This situation has been repeating itself more and more, with areas like Japan, which regularly suffers from earthquakes, living in constant alert. Have you stopped to think how technology has helped U.S. understand earthquakes? Despite the increase in the frequency and intensity of earthquakes, science has also provided us with increasingly advanced tools to better understand seismic phenomena. Today, there are earthquake monitoring systems that can predict the likelihood of tremors in specific regions and even alert the population about potential seismic events. But despite all these technological advances, one thing is certain: earthquakes continue to be an unpredictable force of nature that can strike at any moment without warning. And as the Bible already predicted, they will become more frequent and intense as we approach the end times. What does this mean for the future? When we look at the increase in earthquakes and the biblical prophecies that have been fulfilled in relation to them, we see that we are living in a time of alert. These tremors are not just a reminder of the fragility of our existence, but also a clear sign that we are entering a period of great change and turmoil in the world. The Bible tells us that the end times will be marked by these signs in the heavens and on the earth, and earthquakes are one of these signs. They serve to remind us that the control of the earth is in God's hands, and that we need to be spiritually prepared for what is to come. Have you ever wondered how earthquakes and other signs connect with the fulfillment of the prophecies? While earthquakes continue to be a physical sign that we are living in the last days, they also force us to reflect on our own relationship with God. Are we ready to face what's coming? The increase in frequency and intensity of earthquakes is just the beginning. They remind us that the earth is preparing for the final moment, and we need to be spiritually prepared for what is to come. Have you stopped to think that these signs are warning us to take immediate action? We can no longer ignore the signs manifesting around us. These events make us reflect on the fragility of life and what really matters. While the world lives amidst these signs and catastrophes, it is time to reflect on what we are doing to prepare for the fulfillment of the prophecies that are to come. If you want to know more about how the signs are fulfilling biblical prophecies and how this impacts your life, check out the ebook in the link below. The ebook offers a deeper analysis of the increase in earthquakes and other signs of the end times, connecting them with biblical prophecies and what you can do to prepare for the future. Get ready for the next topic, where we will explore the increase of prophetic knowledge and how this helps us understand the signs of the times. Increase in prophetic knowledge in recent times. One of the most striking prophecies refers to the increase in knowledge. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, it is said that many will run to and fro, and knowledge will increase. When we look at the modern world, we can clearly see that we are living through this exponential increase in knowledge, especially in the areas of science and technology. What was considered impossible just a few decades ago has now become reality. The speed at which information circulates and the amount of knowledge accessible to the public is unprecedented in the history of humanity. But what did the Bible really mean by this? Is this increase in knowledge just a coincidence? Or is there a greater purpose behind it? Have you stopped to think about how technology has advanced in recent years? When we look at technological advancements, it becomes clear that we are living in a unique period. The internet, for example, has changed the way we communicate, work, and even relate to each other. Everything around us is shaped by this ever-evolving digital age. And this is not just a communication phenomenon. Biotechnology, which not long ago seemed fictional, now offers real solutions for curing diseases, genetic manipulation, and even advancements in prolonging human life. Innovations in the medical field are becoming faster and more complex, helping to save lives and treat conditions that were once incurable. Moreover, the field of artificial intelligence has transformed the way we interact with machines, bringing new opportunities and challenges. The amount of available information and access to it is growing at an astonishing rate. Have you ever been surprised by what technology can do these days? Another major advancement that can be observed is space exploration. Never before in history has humanity been so close to understanding the cosmos. In 1969, man took the first steps on the moon, and today we are exploring other planets, with manned missions and probes sent to unimaginable distances. Companies like SpaceX are making space travel more accessible, and the idea of establishing colonies on Mars is no longer science fiction. These advancements, although impressive, are also part of a bigger shift happening in our world. The increase in knowledge about the universe and the possibilities of exploration beyond Earth are signs that humanity is preparing for a future where anything will be possible, but also that knowledge is multiplying. As predicted in the Bible, increase in human consciousness, and IT's impact on prophecies now. When we combine the increase in knowledge in scientific and technological fields with the prophecy of Daniel, we see that we are witnessing a preparation for future times. The multiplication of knowledge is not just a scientific phenomenon, but a preparation for the fulfillment of prophecies that, over time, have become increasingly relevant. The Bible describes that as knowledge increases, people would also become more aware of their spiritual condition, but many would still stray from the divine path, succumbing to deceptions and lies. Therefore, the increase in knowledge becomes a double-edged sword. On one hand, it offers humanity incredible advances and possibilities, but on the other, it challenges us to use this knowledge with wisdom and discernment. What increases knowledge, and how can it impact us? The growing amount of information has its price. The world is saturated with data, but with this comes the difficulty of knowing who to trust and which path to follow. The increase in knowledge, without a solid moral and spiritual foundation, can become a dangerous weapon. Without wisdom, information can be manipulated and used for selfish or destructive purposes. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 16, we see how knowledge and the power of control combined to create a global domination system. Technology and the increase in knowledge can be used to manipulate the masses, leading to total control, which reminds us of Jesus' warning about the need to be vigilant and prepared for the times to come. And what does the increase in knowledge mean for us today? The increase in knowledge, both in the scientific and spiritual fields, presents us with a crucial choice. How will we use this wisdom? As knowledge increases, responsibility also increases. We must be careful in how we apply what we know, as our choices impact not only our lives but the future of all humanity. Knowledge, when used for good, can help transform the world in incredible ways, but when used without discernment, it can lead us down a path of destruction. The Bible urges us to seek God's wisdom in order to use knowledge in a way that honors Him and benefits humanity. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by the amount of information you receive every day? The increase in knowledge is one of the greatest challenges of our age. We live in a world saturated with information, and what the Bible teaches us is that we must seek true wisdom, which comes from God. When we connect with God, He guides us to use knowledge wisely, to build and not destroy, to create and not demolish. Knowledge without wisdom can be dangerous, but when aligned with divine principles, it can lead humanity into a new era of prosperity and peace. Like if you think the increase in knowledge plays an important role in the fulfillment of the prophecies, prepare for the next topic, where we will explore technological progress and space exploration and how this impacts us in the final times. Spiritual knowledge and Bible study in a world where scientific and technological knowledge is growing by leaps and bounds. There is also a significant increase in interest in spiritual matters, especially regarding understanding the scriptures and deepening faith. Never before in history has there been so much material available for Bible study, with translations, books, videos, and even online courses about the scriptures. People are increasingly seeking answers not only to practical everyday issues, but also to existential questions, searching for understanding about the purpose of life, the meaning of suffering, and most importantly, about the future that lies ahead. And what does this mean? Are we really closer to the fulfillment of prophecies? And how does this increase in spiritual knowledge connect with the signs of the last days? Have you ever felt that spiritual knowledge is more accessible today than ever? With the advent of the internet, scriptures, sermons, and Bible studies are accessible to everyone. Today, anyone with an electronic device can access a wealth of resources to learn more about God's Word. In the past, access to the Bible and spiritual teaching was limited, often depending on those who had the knowledge and resources to pass it on. But today, the growth of spiritual knowledge has been immense, with many people dedicating themselves to studying the scriptures and trying to apply God's principles in their lives. But what is the impact of this on society? The growing interest in the Bible and spiritual teachings can be seen as a reflection of the growing emptiness that many people feel. Despite all the material and technological progress, the search for spiritual answers has intensified as people realize that advances in the material world are often not enough to provide lasting peace. What we see, then, is a sort of global spiritual awakening, where many people are turning to the scriptures for comfort, direction, and purpose. This is undoubtedly a sign that something bigger is happening, as knowledge about the Word of God is multiplying, fulfilling the prophecy in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4. What does this mean for the fulfillment of the prophecies? While the search for spiritual knowledge has increased, there is also an increase in challenges for those who seek to live according to God's teachings. The increase in knowledge does not come without obstacles. In many places, the Christian faith is being challenged, and many are turning away from divine principles in search of spiritual alternatives that seem easier or more attractive. However, the Bible teaches us that this growth of spiritual knowledge is a sign of the last days. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 7, we read that people will always be learning but never come to the knowledge of the truth. This is a reflection of the growing spiritual search, but also of the danger of getting lost in the search for answers without turning to the truth revealed in God. Have you ever stopped to think about how the increase in spiritual knowledge has impacted your own life? Have you ever wondered why, amidst so much available knowledge, there is still so much existential emptiness? The increase in knowledge about the scriptures should not just be an intellectual exercise. It should translate into life change, into genuine spiritual growth. And this is one of today's biggest challenges: how to balance knowledge with the true practice of faith. When someone dedicates themselves to studying the Bible but does not put Jesus' teachings into practice, that knowledge becomes just theory, not transformation. What should impact us more, knowledge or the application of knowledge? True spiritual knowledge is not just about knowing what the scriptures say, but about living according to those teachings. It's not enough to just accumulate information. We must apply that wisdom in our daily lives. And this leads to a fundamental question. Are we really living according to God's word, or are we just learning more about it without allowing it to transform our lives? Spiritual knowledge is valuable, but it only has a real impact when it translates into action, in love, in forgiveness, in personal transformation. If you have been following the growth of spiritual knowledge in your life, comment below how this has impacted your faith. Prepare for the next topic, where we will discuss the rise of mockers in the last days and the impact of mockery on Christian beliefs. The rise of mockers in the last days. We live in an era where many mock the Christian faith, disdain the gospel, and ridicule the truth of Christ. These mockers, often driven by the spirit of the Antichrist, attempt to shake the faith of believers and lead people away from the truth. But what many fail to realize is that, although God allows this to happen for a time, His patience is an opportunity for more people to turn to repentance. Have you noticed how mockery against the faith is becoming more common today? In the media, on social media, and even in everyday discussions, mockery against Christ and the gospel has become more frequent. But, as prophesied, this behavior will only increase until the judgment of God is fully manifested. God allows this so that more people will turn to Him. God's patience, although it may seem delayed in our eyes, has a purpose. He wants everyone to come to repentance, and this includes those who today mock His word. But the time of grace will not last forever. If you believe that faith in Christ should be strengthened in today's times, please like and subscribe to the channel. If this video was impactful for you, leave your comment on the topic and share it with others who also need to understand these signs of the times. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos.